Hello, and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about stories, about history, and the stories we tell ourselves about history, about the world, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. My name is Kirsty, and today, on episode 7, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare and Shakespearean stories. Now, I'm sure a few of you groaned and rolled your eyes. Hopefully not too many listeners were so put off by the title that they aren't even listening, but please bear with me. Whether you didn't get the language as a teenager in school, or you're sick of talking about dead white men, there's lots of reasons not to want to talk about Shakespeare. But there's also a lot to talk about in the way Shakespeare's stories have survived. The way they're understood today, the way they were understood at the time, all the stories that are told about William Shakespeare himself. You don't have to like the guy or his work to admit the cultural impact. Not only that, but some of the stories around him give us an opportunity to dive into a few things I touched on in the first episode, around conspiracies and misinformation. So this episode is going to meander a bit through who Shakespeare was, and the stories and conspiracies about him, the stories he told, and how they've lasted. Let's begin with a story of 14-year-old me sitting in English class, already older than Juliet, and possibly still even more naive. I'm not really paying attention, too caught up in the mess inside my own teenage head. We're studying Romeo and Juliet, and I'm jerked out of a daydream of my crush by hearing that the play was based on an earlier Italian story, and that Shakespeare had never been to fair Verona. What? He just plagiarized a story? And made up his depictions of the city? How could he have known what it was like that long ago? And was studying this guy hundreds of years later? What a waste of time. Of course, there is a world of difference between adapting a story for the stage and plagiarism, but that was lost on younger me. Really, of course, it's no different to the hundreds of Marvel adaptations and various other things. So, when I heard a theory that he didn't exist or that Shakespeare was a pen name, I thought it was plausible. He'd never left England, he was just some guy. How did he write all of those plays? Maybe it was someone else. But then I started to learn more about these stories and realised that there was another narrative in here, and one that also involved cherry-picked facts and some biases and distortions. There are many stories about Shakespeare, from him being a genius who invented hundreds of words, to musings on his sexuality, to the idea that he didn't even exist. These stories tell us a lot about the time he lived in, but also a lot about the people telling these stories, and the misconceptions and prejudices of the times since he lived up until today. So let's start with the basics. William Shakespeare was baptised on the 26th of April, 1564. Based on the customs of the time, it's assumed he was born on the 23rd, and that's the date generally celebrated as his birthday. Early on, you can see the gaps where conspiracies start to creep in. We say his birthday is on the 23rd, but if someone asks for proof, it doesn't exist. And then they assume other things are lies. But more on that in a bit. His father was a glover, that is, someone who made gloves. It's a profession that doesn't really exist anymore. But at the time, he was a well-off tradesman. He was also, and this gets left out of some tellings, an alderman and bailiff of Stratford, so someone who had a fair amount of standing in the community. It's assumed that Shakespeare attended the King's New School, a grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon. While, again, we don't have records, it fits with what would have usually been the case for someone like him, from his area and social class at the time. From here, there is a chunk of his life we know very little about. There aren't records from his childhood, but he pops up in the paper trail again when he married at age 18. He and his wife had 3 children, but little more is recorded until he pops up again in London in the theatre scene in the 1590s. However, while we don't know for sure what he was doing in these years, we do have some understanding of the period and can make some educated guesses. There would have been travelling theatre companies who passed through Stratford-upon-Avon from time to time. Many people would have attended these plays, and it is almost certain that young Shakespeare would have done. So, as well as an education in the classics, he would have seen plays, maybe even met actors, and considered this something he could do with his life. Now to the stories, true and less so. One story is that Shakespeare coined, or invented, around 1,700 words. This is not true. He may have been the first to have written down a lot of words, or at least for the text to have survived and been used to trace word origins by the time people started making dictionaries in the 18th century. However, most of the words were in use, just not necessarily written down in texts that survived. More specifically, the 1928 Oxford English Dictionary listed Shakespeare as the first known usage for a lot of common words when it was not actually the case. It's theorised that the authors reached for an early, easy source for the words, and Shakespeare's works were so well known that it was right there. So this story is more of a product of the conditions of Shakespeare's time and his fame. Earlier uses of the words were printed less, documents themselves were older and less likely to survive, less well-known contemporaries were less likely to be reached for when looking for an early example of the use of a word, whereas Shakespeare's work was familiar to those compiling dictionaries, and then this in turn perpetuated his fame. In fact, recent analysis of his texts indicates his vocabulary was not as extensive as that of some other playwrights of the time, such as Marlowe and Greene. I'm not saying this to have a go at him. Vocabulary is not really a measure of literary quality. But by this metric, he was nothing special. There are some words he is still credited with inventing, including downstairs, bedroom, and fashionable. As you can see, well, as you can hear, these are words derived from existing terms. It makes sense. He was writing popular media. You wouldn't want too many unfamiliar words in the text. It would alienate the audience, but saying downstairs, fairly easy to figure out what he means. There is another story about Shakespeare, which goes to a different extreme from credit for inventing hundreds of words. This is the baseless conspiracy theory that Shakespeare didn't write the plays and poems credited to him. Spoiler alert, he did. However, I think it's interesting to explore the narratives involved in the theory. The theory was first published in 2 books in 1857, which claimed that the plays were actually written by Francis Bacon, who paid an uneducated actor named Shakespeare to pretend that they were his. Bacon was not a playwright, and there is no evidence linking him to Shakespeare's plays. Since then, there have been various other theories of who the secret author could be, from Christopher Marlowe to Queen Elizabeth. None of them really hold water, especially as several of these people died while Shakespeare was still writing plays. Some of the theories rely on someone having faked their death or given Shakespeare a pile of manuscripts to release over the following years, which, well, that seems like a lot of trouble to go to. It doesn't really pass the simplest explanation is usually right test. The idea behind the theory is that Shakespeare was a nobody with no particular education. So how could he have written these works? Many of the plays drew on Latin and Greek sources. How could he have accessed and read them? He didn't go to university. In other words, the argument is basically that this country bumpkin couldn't possibly come out of nowhere and have had the education and knowledge to write these plays. This is a very classist argument, and it also displays an ignorance of the education and texts available in the 1580s and 90s. Sure, Shakespeare wasn't a noble, he wasn't upper class, but as I said earlier, he probably went to grammar school. He lived in a nice house in a town, and his father was an affluent tradesman. So it was highly likely he did have an education. While social classes at the time did have an impact on what opportunities people had, there was some mobility and opportunities for middle-class people in towns, and more than is assumed by those spreading these theories of Shakespeare being an uneducated nobody. In addition, in the years before Shakespeare was born, the printing press and movable type made books more accessible. So he was able to read the stories he adapted. During his life, Greek and Roman sources were becoming much more accessible. By the time he was living in London, there was a thriving book market by St Paul's. Indeed, you could get a copy of one of his plays for sixpence, about the same as 3 loaves of bread. So literary works could be purchased by someone who had some means, some spare pennies even. I think it didn't help that there was a lot of misinformation floating around about Shakespeare. There were stories that he was barely literate and came from a much poorer background than was actually the case. These are not based in any evidence, are completely untrue, but have also contributed to the myth that he didn't write the plays. It is true that there were a lot of people who were illiterate, but somewhere between 20 and 30% of men were literate when Shakespeare was a child. And as I said, as the son of a well-off tradesman, he's likely to have been one of them. The conspiracy theory has also been fed by other myths about Shakespeare, including the one I talked about earlier. How could he have invented, or at least been the first written source for so many words? How could someone who didn't attend university have a bigger vocabulary than other writers from the time? These are things that are sometimes put forward as an argument for the real author being someone else. However, as we saw earlier, he didn't have a bigger vocabulary and didn't invent that many words, so the reasoning is a bit of a dead end. Although it's a great example of how one bit of misunderstanding or misinformation can feed wider conspiracies. Shakespeare became so valorised and invented all these words and had such a great vocabulary that it didn't seem realistic, but that's because it wasn't. Anyway, there is lots of evidence that he did write his plays and poems, along with the obvious stuff of it having his name on it and records of his theatre group performing the plays. There was also the fact that his critics didn't doubt his existence. For example, there was a scathing and classist criticism published of an actor writing plays around the time Shakespeare first became popular. It didn't fully name him, but it parodied a line from one of his plays. And his contemporaries didn't like that he hadn't attended university, but they didn't doubt he'd written the works he claimed. Personally, I doubt the upstart crow would have upset Robert Greene so much if it were a pen name. That's, of course, where the show title comes from. If you haven't watched it, it's great fun. There's also the fact that he didn't write his noble characters accurately. He was criticised by some contemporaries for the way he wrote the gentry. Not something that would have happened if the plays were actually written by Queen Elizabeth. Unless you want to get really conspiracy-brained about it. But, again, simplest story is usually true. Shakespeare wasn't a noble. Another thing the theory ignores is how much Shakespeare's work developed over time. His earlier works generally stayed closer to the source material and the standard dramatic formula for the period. His later works tended to draw on more sources, or to have less clear sources. They also played with an inverted form more often. The question of how did Shakespeare, without a university education, write a masterpiece such as Twelfth Night, ignores the 5 years and multiple other comedies he wrote before this. The texts themselves tell us how he reached that point. He wrote plays for over 20 years. Indeed, for all we know, he may well have been writing from when he was in school onward, but the early unpublished texts have not survived. True, there is also no evidence that he was, but as a writer, I find it plausible that he would have been working on things which never saw the light of day for a long time. The theory also doesn't take into account collaboration. There is some evidence that he collaborated on plays produced in the 1590s, before he became known as a playwright. This is both an explanation of how he began to develop his skills and aids our understanding of how plays were produced at the time. These plays didn't have his name on them, but textual analysis suggests that his writing style was involved. Some of his later works were also collaborations with younger playwrights, possibly paying it forward to some degree. Collaboration on plays was common at the time, rather like a TV writer's room is today. Even if one person leads on and is credited with the screenplay, there will have been input from other people. It doesn't mean that Shakespeare didn't write the plays. It just means that he was a lead writer with collaborators. I suppose you could take this as an argument that Shakespeare didn't write his plays, at least in the traditional way we think. But there's evidence that many of his plays also, especially the comedies, were not collaborations. So he definitely was capable of writing on his own. Besides, there's a great deal of difference between the false narrative that Shakespeare was a barely literate country bumpkin who didn't write the plays, and the more accurate and Our Stories and Ourselves favourite nuanced version that Shakespeare wrote or co-wrote his plays. Some had many collaborators, and he also contributed to plays that his name was not on. Not as snappy, but more accurate. The story of Shakespeare is also shaped by the events that happened before and during his life. As I mentioned already, printing had increased the accessibility of Latin and Greek texts. Printing of his own work was also easier, leading to there being more copies which would survive than earlier playwrights. There were an increasing number of grammar schools opening in the years before he was born, and he lived in proximity to a particularly good one. Even if his father wasn't well off, living in town, he would have had access to schooling. In a time before TV and radio, the travelling players would crisscross the country. They would perform in plays in towns and cities, spreading both the stories themselves, but also an understanding of theatre and performance. Some even travelled in Europe. This not only means that Shakespeare would have come across theatre long before he went to London, but that he would have interacted with other actors who had travelled widely. He wrote the plays, but he wasn't sitting alone in an isolated garret while doing so. He was on the road or performing in London around other actors who had also travelled and heard the stories, and who would have shared it with him. Who knows, maybe in that unknown period he did actually go to Europe. Probably not. But he would have known actors that had. In other words, he did not come out of nowhere, in any sense of the phrase. He was a product of the time he lived in, as was his work, which builds on that of many writers who went before him. Yet, despite all of this, the theory that he didn't write the plays endures. I do wonder if the way some people smush all of the past together also plays a role here, at least for those who haven't studied history in any depth. For example, before I started reaching this episode, I had a mental image that in the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, the nobility had tutors and peasants couldn't read, and there wasn't really anything of a middle class. I associated grammar schools with maybe the 18th century, if not later, and while the tutors part for nobility is correct, grammar schools have been around for a very long time, from the late 14th century. Once I actually think about it, it does make sense. Clerks and scribes were needed, and business people would have needed to be able to write and keep accounts. But it's actually kind of cool how long school has existed in some form. Maybe one of the other reasons that the conspiracy stories endure is that they're fun. One theory is that Shakespeare was actually Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was a spy, so there's already an element of romance and mystery there. This then makes the idea that he faked his death and continued to write as Shakespeare even more appealing. However, there's absolutely no evidence for it. There's also, of course, the theory that Shakespeare was a woman, which, I would love for it to be true, but again, absolutely no evidence he was. It's a shame there's so little writing by women available in the period, but that it doesn't mean that he was one. Well, as I've mentioned, the texts that Shakespeare referenced were fairly available at the time. I think there is another dimension to this that I haven't been able to find much discussion about, but I think is worth touching on. And that is that reading is not the only way to get information. As I covered in the first episode, the oral tradition is a great way to share information. Shakespeare may well have heard stories from people around him, as well as read them. In a time when fewer people read, when paper and books were rare and expensive, people told a lot more stories. He wrote a lot of plays, but as with any writer, it was across years, where he toured as a troupe, lived in London, and travelled back and forth to Stratford-upon-Avon. He would have met a lot of people and heard a lot of stories in that time. I touched on this with the actors in Europe, and even though printing was becoming more affordable and easier, it, still had its challenges, and there were a lot of people who weren't literate. He spent years in London, which was a busy port at the time. He would have visited pubs, markets, and theatres where he would have been surrounded by people who had come to the city from all over the world. Ships were arriving from areas including what is now Morocco, Poland, Venice, and Russia. While he may never have set foot in fair Verona, he probably met people who had. Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, and by late 1500s, when Shakespeare was in London, ships of goods from there were arriving all over Europe. These ships also brought people from those places and stories from sailors. There were also a range of foreign creatures in the Queen's menagerie, which he may have visited, although it wasn't cheap. There's also an interesting interplay between the written word and oral tradition. I'd like to explore this more in future. I got some of the information from this episode from a 500-page book called Oral and Literate Culture in England, 1500 to 1700. It's going to take me a while to write the episode on this in detail. But it was saying that many popular ballads were shared via printed materials, and those who could read them would then share them with those who couldn't read. And then the ballads would be passed on through people singing them, even if they couldn't read them. As well as historical stories, there are lots of references to songs and tales in Shakespeare. Many of these were not recorded in writing until much later, or at least not that we have records of now. So it's pretty clear that Shakespeare was participating in an oral culture of sharing stories and songs. It would not surprise me if he also sought out travellers to better understand the places he was writing about. Another part of what has made Shakespeare memorable was that he was prolific. However, his fame also feeds itself. As I mentioned in the opening, Romeo and Juliet was based on an existing story. There are also many later versions, but they tend to be associated with Shakespeare in a way that the earlier versions are not associated with their authors. There are also many later adaptations of the same story, but those tend to be associated with Shakespeare in a way that Shakespeare's version is not associated with the earlier authors. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? You can picture it in your head, right? Even with the rather overdramatic reading I just gave it. Juliet leaning over a balcony, calling out to Romeo below. It's an iconic Shakespearean scene, and it's not in the play. In the play by Shakespeare, it's a window. The balcony comes from a later story. In fact, balcony wasn't a word used in English in Shakespeare's time. They existed in Italy, and Shakespeare may well have heard them described, but there is no balcony in the scene. However, a very similar scene was in a play, written by now almost forgotten playwright Thomas Otway. It even includes the line, "O Marius, Marius, wherefore art thou, Marius?" As with Shakespeare, Otway drew on earlier sources for his work, more than would have be considered acceptable today, as you can see there, but normal for the time. For a long time, Romeo and Juliet was performed rarely, if at all. First, theatres were banned during the Civil War and Cromwell's reign. Then, newer plays, such as Otway's, became popular. However, Shakespeare was then repopularised by David Garrick, among others, in the middle of the 18th century. It was some of these performances that moved Juliet onto the balcony and produced the iconic staging we know. I don't see this as a problem. Plays are often reinterpreted and staged differently over time, but it is interesting that this comes from another playwright. Not only that, but at the time, Shakespeare was little known or produced. However, now, not many people have heard of Otway, and we assume the balcony did come from Shakespeare. This emphasises to me the role that the stories told about Shakespeare have in shaping how we think of him today. As with the issue of which words he invented, his role as the biggest playwright ever is somewhat overstated. This in turn feeds some of the conspiracies. Shakespeare was one of many playwrights of his time, not necessarily considered better back then, which again fits better with his background and history. Without this narrative of him being the biggest name of his time and ever after, I don't think the conspiracy theories would have gained so much traction. So, not only did the changes in the world happening around Shakespeare's life impact how we tell the story today, so did the things which happened afterwards. We can't know exactly the impact that closing theatres had, But I'm sure there was something. Then the increasing popularity and rivalry between theatres and David Garrick's work to popularise theatre in the 18th century led to an increasing interest in Shakespeare's work again. And then it was only after this that people began to wonder if he had actually written the plays. So there are many stories about Shakespeare, starting from that he was a barely literate peasant whose talent shone through and he invented hundreds of words, to he was a unique genius who by far was the best playwright of his age and has been remembered as such ever since. The rather exaggerated myth of who he was has in turn led to a pushback that it's not possible for this to be the case, which was then taken to the other extreme, that he didn't write the plays at all. The reality that he was an educated man whose work was comparable to other playwrights of the time, that he improved his writing over the course of his career and collaborated with others, both on works with others' names on them and works he led on, has got lost in the myths. He was both skilled and talented, but he was also a product of his time, of access to grammar schools and travelling players, and living in a city visited by people from all over the world. So, this is why I wanted to talk about Shakespeare. The myths built around him have then led to conspiracies, and then that has fed into further myths. Inside all of this is a complex reality which tells us not just about the man himself, but also the time he lived in and the societies we've lived in since then. So that's where I'll leave it today. As with my previous episodes, my sources are on my website, ourstoriesandourselves.com. There's a long list for this one, so do have fun exploring it. If you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. As always, to close with a quote, and of course it's Shakespeare today. He did not say that the pen is mightier than the sword, but he did say in Hamlet that many wearing rapiers are afraid of goose quills.